Hi everybody, greetings from a beautiful day here in Cape Town. As you can see, flying here behind me is the old Rhodesian green and white. It was a gift from a very kind gentleman, and I'd like to thank him very much for that. Early Rhodesian history, we better get a move on, otherwise I'm never going to finish this series. 1893, a very busy year for everybody living in Mashonaland and in Matabeleland. Down in Bulawayo, there was a sense of foreboding after an impi had left to move into Mashonaland on a raid. And Percy Crew was lazing around at a place called Dawson's Store in Bulawayo. I don't know where Mr. Dawson was that particular day, but Percy was alone there, and he says suddenly he realized that a large impi, that is a contingent of Matabele fighting warriors, had arrived at the store, and their leader, called an Induna, came to speak to Percy, and he said, "King Lobengula has sent me, and I've got to recover the rifles that are in storage here." Now, these rifles, they were 1,000 brand new Martini Henrys. They were part of a deal concluded between Cecil Rhodes's representatives and Lobengula, whereby through this agreement known as the Rudd Concession, certain mineral rights would be given to the British South Africa Company. Now, there were other provisions as well to this concession, and Lobengula was quite happy to accept those. But for some reason at the time, he declined to accept these rifles. So the man who delivered them, a fellow by the name of Jack Carruthers, a pretty interesting guy in his own way. Jack was one of the first Europeans to farm in the Victoria area. And the place that he owned there was near the Great Zimbabwe Ruins. And at that time, of course, the place had fallen into disrepair. There was nobody around. But Jack found that this was a very convenient spot for him to keep his cattle. So he would use the great enclosure there as a cattle kraal. Anyway, he'd been asked by Rhodes to deliver these rifles. So he had dropped them off there, and then he left. He went on to serve Rhodes, interestingly enough, as an undercover agent amongst the Boers. And it was there, moving amongst them, that he kept his ear to the ground, and he discovered the plans that the Boers had to move into Mashonaland and lay claim to certain parts of the territory. And this information he conveyed to Rhodes, who immediately took steps to prevent that from happening. At any rate, Percy gets out these cases of rifles and lays them down on the ground outside the store and proceeds to break them open. And by this time, there were quite a number of the Matabele army that were acquainted with firearms. But this lot that had arrived at the store, this was something new to them. They were very proficient, of course, in the use of the traditional weapons, the assegai, but they had no idea what to do with these weapons. And Percy says to his amazement, he found inside each of these boxes a number of bayonets, sufficient bayonets to go with each of the rifles. And the Induna, seeing these, asked Percy what was their purpose and how did one use them. So he gave the Induna a bit of instruction, took a bayonet, fixed it to the rifle, and showed him how to do it. And then, unfortunately, a lot of horseplay ensued, and warriors were picking up rifles and fitting the bayonets to this, and one man got quite badly stabbed when his friend playfully prodded at him with a bayonet. In fact, he was quite seriously injured. So with all these rifles handed out, the impi left and proceeded down to the king's kraal. And Percy hadn't been left alone for very long when a wagon trundled up with Johan Collenbrander sitting in the seat and holding the reins. And he called out a greeting to Percy, and he said, man, I can really use one of those boxes right now. It's exactly what I'm looking for. And Percy said, how come? What do you want to do with it? So I said, well, take a look in the back of the wagon. So Percy looked over the edge of the wagon, and there he saw a dead white man. So he said, hey, what's this? What's going on? So Johan explains to him that this fellow must have come from Mashonaland, probably got ill on the way on his journey, lay down in the back of the wagon, and his oxen just kept on plodding, for goodness knows for how many days, and they ended up at Inyati Mission with this man half dead in the back of the wagon. From there, it was decided that he should go to Bulawayo, and so he was sent there. Somebody brought him to Johan Collenbrander's home, and there the man passed away. Nobody knew who he was, nobody knew his name. So Percy says that he was quite worried because it didn't look to him as though the man was dead, and he expressed this opinion to Collenbrander, and Johan said to him, Percy, take a good look, man, the guy is dead, and let's put his body in one of these boxes, and if you wouldn't mind giving me a hand, and we'll bury him. So Percy did this. He said always for the rest of his life he wondered sometimes whether they hadn't buried a man that was alive who just appeared to be dead. But anyway, this makeshift coffin was nailed up, a hole was dug nearby, and this man was laid to rest. And Percy conducted a little funeral service there. Now, I have to smile at this because Percy Crewe was a no-nonsense guy. He was straight down the middle. What you saw is what you got. And he was very direct. And I have said before that he was also a bit coarse in his language. And I would have loved to have been there to hear what this man would have said, because he didn't seem to have much of a religious streak in him. In fact, Percy had very little time for the missionaries that lived in Matabeleland. In fact, he was very scathing of Mr. Rees up at Inyati, and really said unkind things which were unwarranted. But that was Percy, and some years before that, he had also conducted a funeral service. He was on his own, he says, walking through the bush when he came across a grave that had been disturbed by hyenas. These animals had dug up the body, and the bones were scattered around. So Percy, for all his faults, seems to have had a bit of a soft spot in him, and he gathered these bones up and reburied them, covered the grave up, and then put a sign on a nearby tree that said, "Here lies the remains of an unknown white man. May his soul rest in peace." And then when he related the story later on, somebody said to him, "But describe the place where this grave was," which Percy then did. And he said, "But that's not a white man. That was one of Alan Wilson's African servants who also died of illness, and he was buried there." But Percy made no comment. He just kept quiet. So here he was in Bulawayo at this another unidentified grave, and he says a few words. Well, he must have done a good job, because afterwards, as Collenbrander put his hat back on his head, he said, "Well, Percy, I suppose with everything that's going on here in Bulawayo, that's the last decent burial that any white man can expect." And with that, he climbed back on the wagon and trundled off to his home. Percy says the next thing he knew was that there was a messenger. He said, "The king wants to see you." So Percy goes on down to the royal kraal, sees His Majesty Lobengula, and he asks what the problem is. Lobengula says, "You know, I'm rather unhappy about something, because I had an agreement with Rhodes for 1,000 rifles. And my men tell me that it's not 1,000. Percy says, no ways, man. When I issued those rifles, I counted them out myself. There's exactly 1,000 rifles there. So the king says, well, you better go count them again and come and tell me what you find. He says, where are the rifles? They're down at the kraal, cattle kraal. So Percy goes down there. He finds these weapons scattered around all over the place. Matabele warriors lounging around, completely indifferent. And Nduna does his calculations and he says, 1,000. He says, okay, that's fine. That's exactly how many I get too. Go and tell the king. 5 minutes later, then Nduna's back. King says, no ways. First report he got was that there were rifles missing. Check again to make sure. Oh dear. They go through the whole exercise again. So Percy goes back to the king and he says, the 1,000 rifles are there. He said, okay, all right. If that's the case, that's fine. He says, but Percy, there's something else I need you to do. I want you to take 3 of my men. Okay, I'm going to appoint 3 guys. And I want you to take them to Queen Victoria. And I have a message for her. And I want you to explain to her that I didn't want a war with the white people. They complained to me about the telegraph wire that was being cut. And I sent men to punish them. So that she just needs to know that my heart is good. I don't know why he chose Percy, because Percy was no diplomat, but at least he was honest. That much everybody knew. So later on, he sets off with these 3 men off to South Africa. From there, planning to go to England to see Queen Victoria. But of course, Percy being Percy, he was a tough negotiator. And he said to Lobengula, I'm going to need money to do this. And Lobengula said, well, how much? And Percy said, it's going to be a lot of money. And he gave a figure. And Lobengula was no fool himself, and he could see that he was being conned. They said, I'll give you half of that. Oh, I can't do it for half. He said, it's half or nothing. So Percy says, all right, okay. And he sets out. But before he does so, the news comes. A man on horseback arrives, riding furiously, and he goes straight to the European community in Bulawayo. And he says, I've come from the telegraph station, and there's a message from Dr. Jim that the Matabele have attacked the Victoria area, and a number of them have been killed. Captain Lendy has sent them packing. So I want you all here in Bulawayo to move out. You better take the opportunity to split now, because there's going to be a war, and I don't want you people there. So, this caused a great deal of consternation amongst the white people. And it was a few days later before Lobengula got the news. And then the impi arrived back, the survivors. And the mood in Bulawayo became absolutely toxic. Whites were threatened. They were insulted. Percy says at that time he was working on a small mine, actually just on the outskirts of Bulawayo, and that they had a fence around there. And this was prior to him leaving with the 3 Matabeles. And he said this fence was lined with angry Matabele warriors every day, pointing their weapons, threatening, cursing. And he says, I just ignored them. I don't see them. They're invisible. I walk past them and I do my work and I pretend they're not there. And that's how he got through that time. But anyway, he left. Others also wanted to leave. But it was difficult, because the custom was in those days, if you wanted as a white man to enter Matabeleland, you were required to report to the king. It was only common courtesy. Introduce yourself and tell him what you're doing there. By the same token, you couldn't just leave without going to say goodbye. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Lobengula just wanted to know what was going on. Fair enough. So a great many Europeans approached him and said, look, we would like to leave Bulawayo and take our families. And Lobengula did some thinking, and it occurred to him that perhaps what he should do is hang on to as many of these white people as he could, because at least they would be some sort of a bargaining chip. I mean, he at least had hostages there, but if he let them all go, it didn't seem to be a prudent thing for him to agree to. And so he said, nobody leaves. But some did leave. Rees arrived there with his wife and his children. And for some reason, Lobengula said, okay, that's fine, you can go. And when Percy heard of this, he wasn't very pleased. He said, how come some people can go and others can't? And then Percy. He then went on to describe Mr. Rees in some very unflattering terms. And then there were others that left as well. Lobengula sent for Johan Columbrander, and he said, Johanny, I've got a problem, man. There's a consignment of firearms down in the Cape that I've ordered, and their delivery is being held up. Now, this consignment had nothing to do with the Rudd concession at all. This was something completely independent. It was something that the king had organized for himself. He'd ordered a number of weapons, and these would be for the use of his army. But with the rumors of war circulating down there in the Cape, the authorities thought it best, we're not going to send this lot up to Bulawayo. So he said, Johnny, you go down there and speak to whoever is responsible and see what you can do about getting these weapons released and brought back here. And Columbrander said, well, if I go, I presume I can take my wife with me. And he said, yeah, of course. So Johan Columbrander left with his beautiful wife Molly, and they departed. They weren't successful, and they didn't return at that point. And then there was another man as well that Lobengula allowed to go off, and the details escape me now. It's something to do with some cattle, and this man had to attend to that particular business, so he was sent off. But generally speaking, the rest of the Europeans were kept there. And in this unhappy atmosphere, and with rumours of the whites in Mashonaland preparing for war, Lobengula called all his Indunas together, and they had a big council meeting. Now, I came across a website a while ago, a man, an apologist for Lobengula. At least he thinks himself as an apologist. And I really didn't like what I read there, because he was trying to portray the king as a bit of an ignoramus, almost like a primitive individual with a bone in his nose, who was outwitted by this conniving scoundrel Cecil John Rhodes. Now, we need to disabuse ourselves of that kind of thing straight away. It's not true. Lobengula was a very intelligent man, and we can see that in the way that he spoke to his Indunas. Just bear in mind, Lobengula himself personally never faced the white man in battle. But he had heard enough, and he had gathered in as much information as he could about the Europeans' tactics. And from this he formulated an idea of how it would be best to engage them in battle. And so he said to these Indunas, listen, don't attack the whites when they are standing still in their kraals or in their lagers. Now, a lager is an encirclement of wagons, and the cattle and the horses are in the center, and the men fight from within this enclosure. So don't do anything when they're stationary like that. It's not going to work. There are a number of rivers between Mashonaland and Bulawayo, and it is certain that they will come to Bulawayo. When they come to the rivers, this is what they will do. They will send horsemen through the water and up onto the bank on the other side to guard the crossing of the wagons. He said, so the force is going to be divided at that point. You're going to have men on one side of the bank and men and wagons on the other side. Also, you're going to have people in the river actually crossing at any given time. So he said, that is the time when you hit them. You deal with the horsemen on the one bank first, eliminate them, and then in that way, you then turn your attention onto the people on the other bank. And he said, that's what I would like you to do. Now, that advice was good and it was sound, but it was only advice. And in this, we see Lobengula's greatest weakness, and that was that he was not assertive. He actually shouldn't have been a king. He was a good man. It was actually, in some ways, too good to be an African king. Msilakatsi would not have allowed these people to view his words to them as an option or as a suggestion. He would have told them, if you don't do what I have commanded you to do, when you come back here, you're going to taste my assegai, for sure. But Lobengula kind of left it open, you know, here's my contribution to the situation, and I feel that if you do this, you know, it'll work. So consequently, the Indunas thought, well, for what it's worth, you know, we might try it. But we have our own ways of fighting, and the king is a little bit out of touch with things. Jameson would never have tolerated that kind of thing. I mean, there's such a contrast between the two men. With Dr. Jameson, when he gave an order, it was an order, and he expected it to be carried out. Frank Johnson, you know, an impetuous man who seemed to rub everybody up the wrong way. He doesn't tell it like this, but history, I think, is quite clear. He had the nerve to backchat Dr. Jim, who was very quickly put in his place, told to make himself scarce. And so he played no part really in the Matabele War. So Jameson didn't put up with those kind of things, and it's a pity that Lobengula didn't take a leaf out of his book. We are very fortunate, actually, that Lobengula was not a fighting Induna. Had he not been the king, and he'd been out in the field with an impi, I think that the pioneers would have found him a very, very serious adversary. So there were difficult times in Bulawayo and a lot of tension, but there was also a lot of tension in Salisbury, because it now became apparent that there was a clause whereby everybody that was a settler, if called upon to do so, would take up arms and defend the country. You couldn't get out of it. So the Mashonaland Horse, the volunteers were disbanded, a new force was started, and people were told to report. There was a great deal of concern in Mashonaland over the few men that the company could put in the field. Something, I think an estimate was about like 700 men, which is not a lot of people when you're facing another estimated army of 20,000. That's a big difference. And even though the 700 men might be armed with modern weapons, that's still, the odds are very big. So there was concern in Salisbury and in Fort Victoria over this impending war that was coming. In Salisbury, when the column left there, the men who were to do the fighting, all that remained were elderly, old men and young boys who had been given the task of defending the women and children. So they all barricaded themselves in the Salisbury prison, and there they prayed and hoped that their men would find success on the battlefield. because everybody knew if they were defeated, the Matabele army would sweep into Mashonaland, and there was no doubt in anybody's mind that they would kill every single white woman, man and child that they found, and take their vengeance out on the Mashona as well. So it was a serious time, and there was a lot at stake. Fort Victoria also mustered a lot of men, known as the Victoria Column, and they comprised of a force known as the Victoria Rangers. Now, I said a moment ago that I saw something on the internet, but I also saw another website a while ago where a man was no friend of Rhodesia, and I think probably no friend of America's either. And he was having quite a bit of a rant, and he was saying something along the lines of, how is it possible that a country which no longer exists, that was situated in Central Africa, has such a fascination for a section of the American population? What on earth is it that they see about this that they think is praiseworthy at all? Rhodesia was nothing but a blatant racist country, and it stood for everything. It stood against everything that America stood for. And he was quite perplexed at this, and he was trying to figure out an answer. Well, I can try and help him there, and the answer is quite simple. There is something about Rhodesia that resonates with a large section of Americans, and the reason is because in our early history, a great many Americans came and settled in Rhodesia, and they made a tremendous contribution to that country, and they left their mark on our history. We had, that famous scout, Russell Burnham. He came and settled in Rhodesia. A brilliant man at fieldcraft, an absolute genius at tracking. And I mean, he brought all these skills with him, and these things were passed on to our people. He was a man raised amongst the Apache Indians, fought against Indians, an old Indian fighter, a real man's man, a wonderful credit to the country where he came from. And I think he should be better remembered, really. I think that there's a national park somewhere in the States named after him, Burnham. But otherwise he appears to be a sort of a forgotten figure. And then there were other Americans too, a fellow by the name of Pete Ingram, also a very good scout, famous man there, and I'll explain later on the connection between these two. I think Ingram became Burnham's brother-in-law at some point later, but they played a very important part in the development of the country. And then there were other Americans too. There was one fella, I might be mistaken about his name, Andy Hammond, I think he was called. I might be wrong about the surname, but certainly he was Andy. And he was involved in a gunfight back in the Old West, and took a few bullet hits and fell down in the street and was lying there. And his assailant was getting ready to kill him, when a lady ran out from the sidewalk into the street and held up her skirts like this, so that the gunman couldn't see his victim lying on the ground. And she pleaded for the life of this man. Now, I don't know what the connection was between this woman and Andy. Perhaps there was no connection. Maybe she just didn't like what she saw there in the street, and she tried to stop it. But even in the Old West, even amongst the scoundrels and the criminals, there was some sort of code of chivalry. And so this man, seeing the woman standing in front of him there, you know, what could he do? I mean, he's not going to shoot a woman or be rude to her. So he put his weapon away, turned on his heel, and went off. So Andy was picked up and carried off, and they patched him up. And afterwards, he must have thought, the time has come for me to find other stomping grounds. And so he left America, this gunslinger, came to Rhodesia, and took up prospecting. And he always walked around with his 6-shooter on his hip. That was his habit. And it paid off well one day when he and I think 2 other men were prospecting on the banks of the Guelo River, when suddenly a group of warriors came out of the bush and rushed at them, ready to spear them. Andy was the only one armed, and before these natives knew what had happened, his pistol was in his hand, and it was bam, bam, bam. Well, there were too many of them. They assegaied him, they assegaied the others, they were all killed. But later on, when somebody came to recover the bodies, they found a number of warriors lying there in a semicircle around Andy. One dead man for every bullet in his 6-shooter. So they had tangled with the wrong guy, really. Yeah, so we had Americans there that played a big part. Burnham was a member of the Victoria Rangers, and he tells us about how these men were all mustered there. And Alan Wilson, he was a major, the CO of that unit, paired the men up with the horses. I suppose that was an important thing in those days. I don't know too much about that. But he made sure that the animals and the men were perfectly matched. The next day he called for a parade, Burnham says, and he looked around, and there were 200 horsemen, and if they thought they could fool Wilson, they had another thing coming, because he began to pick the men out one by one. You, come here. Is that the horse I gave you yesterday? I'm not sure, sir. You're not sure, but I happen to be sure. Your horse is over there. Go and fetch it. And so he had this detailed mind, and you know, he was a man with many other important skills and talents. A good man, and his men loved him. So they moved off to meet up with the Salisbury column, and they met at a place called Iron Mine Hill. And that was because the settlers had found some old iron workings there that natives had dug up years ago, and they used to process iron there. So this was the place right on the border of Mashonaland and Matabeleland, where the force would muster and from where they would move into the country to take Bulawayo. There was another group with them, and they're quite interesting. You know, we tend to think, when we talk about the occupation of Zambezia, that these were all purely white people who were brought into the country by roads. But there were black settlers too, and amongst them were people from South Africa, from a tribe which I think has now been assimilated into other people. I don't think that they exist anymore, known as the Fingos. And so here was a unit of between 400 odd men under the command of a Lieutenant Quested. And there were a number of these Fingo settlers with them. And the rest of them were made up of Mashona warriors. So this was the force that was ready to attack from the northeast. But from the south, King Khama of Bechuanaland was moving in to attack Bulawayo too, and he had a force of 700 African warriors with him. So at that time, it seemed like everybody in the vicinity of Zambezia had had enough of the Matabele. So he was facing the might. Lobengula was facing the might of the white man, plus hundreds of disgruntled and unhappy Africans who wanted the situation changed for good. And before this force left Einmine Hill, Jameson addressed them, and he said, listen guys, there's a lot hanging on the success of this operation. If we fail, our families are going to suffer for it. So from here on, the word is, when in doubt, attack. And with that, they set out into Matabeleland. Now the column moved in two files, if I can put it that way. So you had one group of wagons in one line and another group in the other, and they moved along parallel. And the reason why they did that was if there was a sudden attack, the lead wagons could just swing inwards and meet up, and the trailing wagons the same. And then almost instantaneously, you'd have a laager formed there. And so this is the way that they proceeded. And as this column advanced, so the Matabele people living there retired before them. They retreated, leaving behind deserted and abandoned villages and pockets of people here and there, and also a number of Mashona slaves. Mashona women and men and children who had taken the opportunity in the confusion caused by the sudden retreat of the Matabele nation to get away from their masters. And so the column gathered up these people, as it were, and so they proceeded. And the first casualty was a Captain Campbell. He had seen a herd of unattended cattle. He thought there were no enemy around, so with a few troopers he rode out to round up these animals and bring them back to the column. But suddenly gunfire erupted, and he was hit and very badly wounded, and then he was brought back to the column in this injured condition. And there, amongst all the troops, was a bishop, a clergyman by the name of Knight Bruce. And he tells us he was there when Campbell was brought in. Dr. Jim himself amputated Campbell's leg, took it right off, but it didn't look as though he would survive. And so Knight Bruce sat with the man for most of the evening, talking, and it seemed to him as though Campbell was in good spirits. But then suddenly the captain stopped talking, and when the bishop had a closer look in the dark, he saw that this man had succumbed to his wounds and had passed away. So Captain Campbell was buried by moonlight at midnight in that obscure spot, and I suppose nobody knows exactly today where that is. The next day, another trooper who had also been injured in that contact also died. So they'd lost 2 men already now. And then you may recall that when the pioneer column was moving up towards what was to become Salisbury, at some point Sir Lou, the scout that was guiding them, resigned his position because Rhodes had asked him to do something else. And Sir Lou had entrusted the scouting for the pioneer column to a man by the name of Burnett. A very good man. I have found nothing but praise for this man, or whatever I have read. Everybody has said the nicest and the kindest things about this man. And he was a very, very good tracker and a very good scout. Well, he moved toward a deserted village a few days after Campbell had been killed. And it looked to him as though everything was deserted there. There was nobody around. But then he saw 3 African women with an African man standing beside them. And he rode up. He was accompanied by some troopers. And he asked them, was there anybody else in the village? And they said, no, we are the only people. Everybody's left. And they seemed friendly enough and open enough. So, it just seemed that there was nothing really of great interest there amongst that cluster of huts. So the troopers went off because something else had caught their attention, leaving Burnett alone. And he climbed off his horse and walked toward, for some reason, he walked toward one of these unoccupied huts. But it was in fact occupied. And from inside this hut, through the open doorway, a shot was suddenly fired. And it hit Burnett, and he fell down. The other troopers looked, and their immediate reaction was that he must have had an accidental discharge. They couldn't see any sign of anybody around. And they rode back quickly to see if they could help him, but he was too far gone, and he died later that afternoon. But it did strike them that they were not alone, and that there was somebody in this hut. So they fired a few rounds into it, and sure enough, they were met by shots coming through the doorway at them. It didn't matter how many bullets they put into that hut. It seemed that they couldn't hit this hidden assassin in the darkness there. So somebody got the idea, let's set the roof on fire, the thatch roof. And they did. And it wasn't long before this individual came running out. And then they nailed him, killed him there, and then that was the end of him. Amongst those troopers, there was another officer, I think his name was Williams, who owned a horse by the curious name of Bulawayo. And a few days after that happened, after poor Burnett was laid to rest, he was involved in a contact with the enemy. And Bulawayo, this dumb horse, took it into his head to charge the enemy on his own. It didn't matter how much his rider tried to turn him one way or the other, it was to no avail. He rode straight into a mass of Matabele warriors who promptly assegaied the animal. Williams leapt off the dying horse, ran to a nearby rock and tried to, defend himself as best as he could. The contact was so hot that his men couldn't get to him, and unfortunately he was shot there as he stood his ground. So the advancement of the column was not without incidents. But then they arrived at the Shangani River. And Burnham had gone out with some other scouts, looked around, could see no sign of the enemy. And they proceeded, the men at the column proceeded to level the banks of the river, cut ramps into the soil, try and move whatever rocks they could out of the riverbed, and try and make the path easier for these 2 lines of wagons to move through. And as Lobengula had said, they had in fact sent through a mounted force to guard the crossing. But all these preparations took the best part of the day. And when they got through the river, they advanced. It wasn't more than a couple of kilometers away from the water's edge when it was time to make lager for the night. And so they put the wagons in a circle, and actually two circles next to each other if one wants to be particular about details. And Quested and his auxiliaries went off a little distance, and they made a camp of their own. And part of the reason was because that afternoon they had gathered in a number of Mashona captives that had been, that had run away from the Matabele. And there were a number of women amongst them. And these women were known to some of the auxiliaries. And so it was a time of reunion and a time of embracing and a time of celebration, that these people had been found alive. And this noise carried on in the camp, and everybody thought it would settle down after a while, but it didn't. It continued right through the night, jabbering and talking and laughing and joking, and they were just so happy. Burnham and his party returned after dark, and they didn't approach the camp. They decided that they would sleep outside the laager. Sometime during the night, Forbes decided to set off a few rockets as a signal to some men that were out of the laager, and he just wanted them to know in which direction they ought to ride to return. But nobody knew that the Matabele army had now been creeping up through the night onto them. And their intention was to attack sometime at midnight, in the dead of night. But with these rockets going off, it rather unsettled them, and they weren't too sure what that was about, and so they hesitated. And they waited and they waited for the morning to pass, so that when sunlight came, they'd be able to see what was going on. But now at about 3:45 in the morning, it was nearly time to stand to. I don't know if modern armies do this kind of thing, but certainly when I was in 5RR, when we were at Chiweshi, and we were, encamped in company strength, our company commander Tex insisted upon this. And this was done religiously every day. 4 o'clock in the morning, we would stand to. And even now, as I talk to you, I can picture the early morning night sky. We'd be staring out at the landscape, the Southern Cross in the heavens above us. I can see our platoon commander standing on an anthill, silhouetted against the rising sun. And there we would remain till about 6 o'clock, and then we would be stood down. And the same thing happened in the evening. We would stand to. And this is what the column did that morning. They were getting ready for the stand to, when suddenly shots were fired in the dark, and there were cries of alarm. And only then did they realize that the Matabele were upon them. What had happened was that some of Quested's men had decided that they would go down to the Shangani River, which wasn't so far from them, and go and get water. And they had stumbled into this impi lying in the dark. The Matabele immediately attacked Quested's camp first, ran in amongst the auxiliaries there, stabbing left, right and centre, killing everything that moved in front of them. And of course, this was accompanied by a great deal of screaming and shouting and noise and gunfire. Another group of Matabele then attacked the main laager, and although it was dark, every moment it was getting lighter, and the powder that they used in those days gave off a white puff as the weapons were fired. So here were these Martini Henrys now, which Rhodes had given to Lobengula in good faith, now turned on his own men. And in the dark, you could see these puffs. So the troopers, the bugles were sounding. The men were quickly roused from their sleep, stood to their stations, and returned fire. Captain Lendy was there, and he had 5 Maxim guns under his command. Now, the Maxim gun was a forerunner of the Vickers machine gun, a very famous weapon used in subsequent wars, built by the same company. But this was the first time that they'd been used in warfare, and they performed admirably. So much so that as Lendy opened up with these weapons, the Matabele's were just mowed down. That was what Knight Bruce said afterwards. It was like grass that had been cut. And he went after the battle walked amongst the dead Matabele, and he said, I never saw one body that had less than 2 rounds in it, and one man from one shoulder to the other had 7 bullets in his chest. He said that is how devastating the fire was from the Maxims. So then there was a lull in the fighting after that, and everything quietened down. And then as the sun came up, Quested by this time had made his way to the main camp. He had been badly wounded in the battle, been shot a couple of times. His thumb had been shot off, and he was now with the main group. The auxiliaries were scattered around the bush. Nobody knew who was who, where they had gone to, fleeing for their lives before the Matabele warriors. And then a group of what seemed to be Quested's men came over a rise and started walking down toward the main lager. And Forbes, who was standing watching this, quickly gave orders, nobody shoot. Those looked like men from the auxiliary unit. And sure enough, these guys just ambled along very casually, looking almost dazed and stunned as they made their way closer to the camp. And one of the junior officers in charge of a Maxim, he warned Forbes, and he said, "Sir, I think those are that's the enemy." Forbes said, "Don't you dare shoot, but keep an eye on them." And when these people got to about 150 meters away from the camp, they suddenly sat down, and weapons that they'd been holding against their sides and concealed from view were suddenly produced, put to their shoulder, and they opened fire on the troopers. But the Maxims again did their work. They cut these people down. Another wave of Matabele came. They were cut down too. They couldn't understand what it was that they were facing. They were brave men, but bravery cannot help you against that kind of technology. And so eventually the fight petered out. Jack Carruthers was there with his brother. His brother made a name for himself. He was a man who could speak Sindebele fluently. You couldn't tell that this was a white man if you were out of sight and you heard him talking. And he was talking to the Matabele, calling across the open space. And I don't know what he said to them, but quite a long conversation took place there. They eventually retreated. The Nduna, that was in charge of this engagement, hung himself. He couldn't face the disgrace of going back to Bulawayo with the news that he'd been defeated. And why were they defeated? Because they didn't listen to what the king had told them to do. And then, of course, the awful work began of gathering in the dead and the wounded. Of all those Mashona women that had been rescued, only one was still alive. And she had had a baby with her that the Matabele had slain in the night. And this little body was lying there dead. And amongst these people could be heard the cries of another baby. And so Night Bruce said, we gathered this little child up and we took it to this woman. But it's only when we got to her that we saw how badly she'd been wounded. She was the only woman to survive that attack. She'd been stabbed in the back, and an assegai had gone through her one breast. How that she had even got through the night was a mystery. But they stood there with this baby. I mean, what could they say? Her own child was lying there before her dead. She was so badly injured, and now they still brought her another kid to look after. Well, there was nobody else to look after the child, and so they asked her would she accept it, which she did. And there's quite a few accounts of that battle, and I think that most of the written accounts talk about this woman. I mean, people noticed this and they were affected by it. Those that were so badly injured that they couldn't walk were put into the wagons. But this woman, she walked along with the other wounded, carrying this baby. And one wonders what went through her mind, walking along so badly injured, tears streaming down her face, holding this child that she now was responsible for, knowing that her own baby, she'd never hold him again. And, you know, whatever criticism we might have today in this world about colonizers, let us just admit one thing and acknowledge it openly and gladly, that colonialism put a stop to that kind of savagery. It came to an end. The Matabele would no longer henceforth be permitted to run wild amongst the Mashona and inflict that kind of misery and hardship upon them. And yes, it's good and well for me to say that, but at that time in England, that was not the sentiment. We didn't have many friends. We had attacked Mozambique. We had ruffled the feathers of the British politicians, and now we had attacked Matabeleland. And the Right Honourable Henry Labouchere had a lot to say, beating the Rhodesian dog with a political stick every time he could in the House of Commons. We suffered terrible criticism. It was reported how that we had just shot innocent Matabele, gave them no quarter. These poor people were just slaughtered because we were looking for an excuse to start a war. And this was the kind of nonsense that was going on in Parliament. It was the kind of thing that was being repeated in the newspapers. And it was all ably abetted by the Aborigine Protection Society, who had a lot to say. And of course, these people were missing. None of them ever bothered to come out to Zambezia and to talk to Lobengula and discuss the things that were going on, how that they were massacring the Mashona people. They never did that. But when we stepped in to stop it, then they had a lot to say. And in fact, it rather set the tone of relations between Britain and Rhodesia for the rest of our existence. We were big friends when Britain had wars to fight. Then they loved us. First World War, Second World War, Boer War. We were great chums. But the rest of the time, they didn't know how to handle us. There were three policy departments in England: Home Affairs, Foreign Affairs, which involved Commonwealth Affairs, and then there was Rhodesian Affairs, because nobody quite knew how to deal with Rhodesia. And you can be sure, the day that this flag was drawn down for the last time, there was many a British Liberal that heaved a sigh of relief. So Captain Lendy, poor Charlie Lendy, came in for special criticism. It was said of this man in Parliament that he does not have the right to call himself an Englishman. But I can tell you that if it wasn't for Lendy and his Maxim guns, there wouldn't have been an Englishman left alive in Zambezia. So, yeah, I can't tell you how many Mashona people were killed from the auxiliary unit. I don't think that anybody could number them. Many of them fled into the bush. They were missing. They were never found. But we know that Matabele losses, 1,500 approximately. And the troopers, how many did the BSAP lose? 4. It's the Maxim gun that made the difference. So the battle was over. Battle of Shangani had been won, but it was wasn't the only battle to be fought along that river, and we'll be dealing with some of those others as well. Now, I think I'm going to stop here. I don't know how long I've been talking, but I'm getting tired of my own voice. I think I've been speaking for a long time now. So let's leave it there, and we'll continue next time with the progress of the column into Matabeleland. And I hope it won't be too long before I get round to doing that. So in the meantime, thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your patience with me. Take care, look after yourself, God bless you, and until we meet again, cheers.